All right, subscribers, welcome back to another episode of Science with Scopic. Today what we're going to be talking about is section 1.2, which deals with chemistry and matter. Now, before we get going into the details of these notes, there are a couple of objectives that I want you to be able to meet by the end of this video. So objective number 1 is to define chemistry and matter. Objective number 2, compare and contrast mass and weight. And objective number 3, explain why chemists are interested in a submicroscopic description of matter. So we start out here with chemistry and a basic definition of what chemistry is. So chemistry is defined as the study of matter and the changes that it undergoes. Now, the really neat thing about chemistry is that it can be applied to all branches of science. So it can be applied to biology, physics, geology, ecology, and other branches of science. It is the central science. Now, chemistry is also going to play a central role to discoveries made in both science and technology. Okay, so now that we have this idea of what chemistry is, we can get into some additional concepts, and that is defining our matter and mass. So we start out here with matter, and matter is defined as anything that has mass and takes up space. Now, examples of matter include things like textbook, air, or food. Now, it's important to know what is not considered matter. So things that aren't considered matter are thoughts or ideas you may have in your head, heat, light, radio waves, magnetic fields, feelings, emotions, microwaves, and sound. And those are only a few examples of things that are not matter. So the key thing to distinguish or identify if something is matter is that it has mass and it takes up space or has a volume. So we get to this idea of mass, what mass is. And mass is defined as a measurement that reflects the amount of matter in a particular object. Now, you might have heard before weight, a term that is often confused with mass. And what I want to do is distinguish why in science we use mass and why we do not use weight. So weight is defined as the measure of the amount of matter and the effects of gravitational pull on that matter. Now, something to keep in mind here is that just on Earth, the gravitational pull is not exactly the same everywhere. And actually, the gravitational pull here on Earth is going to become less as you move away from Earth's surface at sea level. And we have to remember the gravitational pull is going to vary depending where you are on the universe or where you are in the universe. So an example of this is our celestial bodies, such as planets, asteroids, things that we would find scattered throughout the universe, are going to have a different gravitational pull, and thus our weight on each of these bodies is going to be a little bit different. So this brings us to an important point of why scientists are going to use mass instead of weight. So mass is going to allow scientists to compare the measurements in different parts of the world. So, for example here, if I am running a very similar, if not the same study in America here, and I want to compare my results to another scientist in another country, I can do that with mass, as long as we are sharing our results here in mass instead of weight. Weight, I'm going to have to worry about conversions. I'm going to have to worry about how much actual gravitational pull is in an area, but mass, I don't have to worry about those things. The other thing to remember here is that mass is the measurement of matter that is independent of gravitational force. So again, if I am talking about the mass of one object, it is going to be the same mass whether I measure it here on Earth or I go to the Mars or Moon. That is because those are independent of gravitational force, which means they'll be the same throughout the universe. Now we can transition again to another key concept of chemistry. And that key concept here is distinguishing between microscopic and macroscopic views of the world. So we start out here with macroscopic views of the world, and macroscopic view is defined as an object or events that you do not need a microscope to see. Much of the matter in the entire world and universe for that instance here is behavior that is considered macroscopic. A good example of this is chemical reactions. Now, let's consider one chemical reaction with some very simple substances. So in my example here, what I have in this beaker is just acetic acid, and it's a clear, colorless liquid. And I also have sodium baking soda or sodium bicarbonate. Now, chemical reaction here, I'm going to pour a little bit of the vinegar or the acetic acid into my sodium bicarbonate, and I'm going to see what happens. All right, so as I pour this in, I know I will adjust the camera here a little bit, but as I pour our acetic acid, our vinegar in, check out what happens. We get bubbles, we get fizzing, you can hear that on the camera, but we can visually see, without looking at this reaction underneath a microscope, we can see something's happening, something's changing in our beaker. And again, I can pour more and more acetic acid to react with the baking soda, and we can see with our naked eye that we have a chemical reaction. All right, so again, our example here is baking soda and vinegar or sodium bicarbonate and our acetic acid. So again, the example that we saw was a chemical reaction, and it was between baking soda and vinegar, or our chemical names for baking soda and vinegar are sodium bicarbonate and acetic acid. Now, what we have here is the microscopic term here, and the microscopic term is defined as objects or events that need a microscope to be seen. So we can't see these things, these microscopic events happening just by looking at it with our naked eyes or just by seeing something. And so we have to remember that many microscopic objects are composed of millions of atoms. Now, this concept or this term of atoms is really, really important for us, and it's actually something we take a really detailed look a little bit later in this chemistry section or this chemistry unit. But atoms are the building blocks of matters, and these are the particles, the smallest particles that make up matter. And so right now, this is a very, very simple and basic definition of our atoms, but they are going to be studied in more detail. We need to know that, hey, anything that we talk about in terms of matter is going to be based, or it's going to have very simple particles called atoms. Now, let's go a little bit further here with this microscopic business, and we're going to eventually tie it into the role that it plays into chemistry. So we go and we have this additional term that we can see here is a submicroscopic event. Now, a submicroscopic event consists of objects like atoms that are so tiny that they can't even be seen with our optical microscopes. Now, what's important for us is that the structure, composition, and behavior of all matter can be explained on the submicroscopic level. So a key takeaway here with this concept of submicroscopic object, and that is this. All that we observed, so that chemical reaction between acetic acid and baking soda, that can be explained by the atoms that are contained within those two substances and the changes that they undergo. Okay, so now let's tie all these concepts together with the macroscopic, microscopic, and submicroscopic terms, and let's piece it together of what really is the goal of chemistry. Well, the goal of chemistry is to seek to explain the submicroscopic events that lead to macroscopic observations. Now, to take these really small particles, these submicroscopic particles, what we have to do is we typically have to make a model, and that model is a visual representation of submicroscopic events. All right, so this goal of chemistry is really something important to keep in mind as we study these basic topics of chemistry. We're looking for a submicroscopic explanation that lead to those macroscopic observations. So why did we see that acetic acid and vinegar react together and produce those white bubbles and produce that gas that was emitted? Why can we see that, and what's happening on a submicroscopic level? So what is specifically happening to those atoms? Now that we have the idea and the goals of chemistry in mind, it's important to introduce you to the different types of chemistry. So, because chemistry is dealing with matter, which is anything that has space and has mass, because those things are so many things in the universe, what happens is that we have to have different fields of chemistry or different areas of chemistry that emphasize their study on one particular area. So we divide chemistry into 5 major branches. The first of which is organic chemistry. Now, organic chemistry is emphasizing the area of chemistry that contains most carbon-containing chemicals. And so examples of work in organic chemistry include things like pharmaceuticals or plastics. Now, another branch of chemistry is inorganic chemistry. Now, the area of emphasis for inorganic chemistry is most matter that does not contain carbon. So things like inorganic chemists may study are things like minerals, metals and nonmetals, and semiconductors. A third branch of chemistry is physical chemistry. And physical chemistry has an area of emphasis on the behavior and changes of matter and the related energy changes. So things that a physical chemist may study is the reaction rates, or what we call a reaction mechanism of a certain type of reaction. A fourth branch of chemistry is known as analytical chemistry. Now, the area of emphasis that analytical chemists are focused on are the components and composition of substances. So what they're going to do is they're going to analyze the specific amount and percentages of certain chemicals. And so some examples here of analytical chemists, they could analyze things that are in foods or food nutrients, and they can also be a quality control to see how much of a reaction is actually happening in a lab type of event. Now, a fifth branch of chemistry is biochemistry. And the area of emphasis for biochemistry is matter and the processes of living organisms. Now, some things that a biochemist may study is something like metabolism or fermentation that occurs in those living substances. Now, again, these are our major branches of chemistry, and obviously there are sub-branches within each of these branches, but there are some important areas that are not necessarily in these branches that we should talk about. So the first of which is an area of chemistry we know as theoretical chemistry. So theoretical chemistry is going to focus on why and how chemicals react. And another area of chemistry is environmental chemistry. And environmental chemistry is going to deal with the role that chemistry plays in the environment. Now, to help summarize these 5 branches, I have provided a chart contained within these notes. So those 5 branches that I just talked about and those areas of emphasis that they focus on are listed here in this chart. Okay, so this concludes section 1.2. We've introduced what is chemistry, the difference between that mass and weight, and how chemistry can be used to help interact or help tie together the submicroscopic, microscopic, and macroscopic worlds or views of matter together. I hope you have enjoyed this episode, and if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe.